Well, welcome to another week of the Queensland Conservative, the show that is all things Queensland. I'm Lyle Shelton. Coming up, I take a look at Chinese bullying and give the Morrison government and the Trump administration a big tick for standing up to it. And I look at bullying of another type, but nonetheless totalitarian in its nature. The battle for freedom in post-same-sex marriage Australia. But first, the Greens. Just when you thought there was nothing new the Greens could say to raise an eyebrow, there was this. Adam Bandt, the Greens member for the seat of Melbourne, announced last week he will introduce a bill into the federal parliament to send to jail any Australian who burns coal after 2030. That's just 12 years away. I kid you not. If you have a heritage steam railway, you will be generously granted an exemption, but for everyone else, it's off to the clink. Even export of coal, unless it is coking coal for steel making, would put you in the slammer. Now, Australia is the world's biggest coal exporter, and here in Queensland, the economic contribution of coal, gas and other minerals is $63 billion per year. More than 300,000 Queensland jobs, directly or indirectly, are linked to the resources sector. But the Greens don't care. The policy of Adam Bandt and his colleague who represents Queensland in the Senate, Larissa Waters, would destroy the Queensland economy. That's not hyperbole, that is fact. The Greens say that coal is like asbestos. It's toxic and we have to get rid of it. If the Greens really believed their climate alarmism, they would support a switch of power generation to emissions-free nuclear power. But guess what? The Greens have led the major parties in a tripartisan ban on even investigating nuclear power in uranium-rich Australia. And here in Queensland, thanks to the major parties kowtowing to Greens leadership, even the LNP leader, Deb Frecklington, has announced that the LNP policy is for a future without coal. The Greens should have been laughed out of town for their announcement that they want to jail Australians for burning coal. But the major parties are captured by Paris and climate alarmism, and Australia continues to drift towards disaster. The Australian energy market operator is already warning of summer blackouts because we've closed down 10 coal-fired power stations without replacing the generating capacity. It's embarrassing. Taxpayer-subsidised intermittent wind and solar just can't power a modern industrialised economy. We are heading for trouble unless new coal or nuclear baseload electricity generation is constructed soon. So far, there are no plans. Forget the government's rhetoric of bringing down your electricity bill. The only thing that will give you relief is an increase of supply of reliable baseload power, which can only come from coal or nuclear. Meanwhile, hundreds of coal-fired power stations are under construction to meet baseload power needs in other countries. Ironically, many of these will be burning Australian coal. We are continually told by the Greens, Labor and even Liberals that coal-fired power stations are uneconomic going forward. But the rest of the world doesn't think so. We are drifting as a nation on energy policy because we are paralysed by our belief that carbon dioxide emissions are wrecking the planet. Never mind that Australia's contribution is just 1.3%, and even if we stop these emissions tomorrow, it would make virtually no difference. I want to say out loud that burning coal is an act of economic heroism. You are providing affordable and reliable electricity. I want everyone to know it is okay to burn coal. It is not a crime, it is good. Sadly, the Greens have led the way and the other parties have followed. Because they have swallowed the climate change Kool-Aid, it is difficult for them to argue with the Greens' logic that coal is toxic and that people should be jailed for using it. That's why I'm asking you to help me replace Larissa Waters in the Senate. It's nothing personal, it's just that her Green Party ideas are threatening our very way of life for no good reason. But this election, there is hope. The Conservatives are offering a positive, principled, common-sense alternative in the Senate where we can watch your back. Imagine if Conservatives were there instead of the Greens. This is not an impossible dream. It is what thousands of Conservative supporters are fighting for all over Queensland. We are in with a chance, and with your help, we can boot the Greens. I'm Lyle Shelton. I'm your Conservative alternative to the Greens in the Senate. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome back to the Queensland Conservative. You're with Lyle Shelton. Well, last week was a little bit sad for me and the team who fought the good fight to preserve the definition of marriage. Thursday, November 15, was the first anniversary of the announcement that Australians had voted for same-sex marriage. Now, I don't blame my fellow Australians for choosing this, and I accept the democratic decision of the people, even though I disagree. The reason I don't blame them is because they were told over and over again that there would be no consequences. They were told that it was a simple decision about the love of two people that affected no one else's rights or freedoms. When we raised the consequences during the debate, the likes of Tony Abbott's sister, Christine Forster, accused us of throwing up red herrings and furphies. If only we were. Right now, the freedom of parents to choose to have their children educated in a school community which reflects their values on marriage is the subject of a Senate inquiry. No consequences? Well, if you're a parent like me, whose values differ to that of the rainbow political movement, you are right here, right now, under the gun. But there's more. At the weekend, news broke that the wedding magazine White was forced to close because activists targeted its staff and advertisers with accusations of bigotry. Why? Because White magazine was run by Christians who chose to feature only weddings that contained one man and one woman. Luke and Carla Burrell had even refused to take sides in the same-sex marriage debate because they believed it was an unloving conversation. And they were right. They just wanted to get on with their lives in peace. But there is no peace, even for those who try to stay neutral. A rainbow-coloured fist reached out and grabbed these peace-loving people. White magazine was forced to close. The activists' demonisation of advertisers as participants in bigotry scared them away. Another victim of the consequences of change is Perth photographer Jason Tay. He was asked to photograph some children being raised by a same-sex couple. He said he was happy to do the work, but confided that he did not agree with same-sex marriage. Simply voicing his sincerely held belief has landed him in trouble with the law. He remains before the Western Australian Administrative Appeals Tribunal. It's hard to believe these things are happening in Australia. You see, the law is a teacher. When the marriage law changed, it meant that the previous definition of marriage became unlawful. It is only logical that holding that view is bigotry and that demonising anyone associated with upholding that vision of marriage is fair game. Now, the Coalition promised to protect people's freedoms. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull set up the Ruddock Review into religious freedom, but it has not been released. I was asked to comment about these cases and the erosion of freedom on Sky News last Sunday.
People are afraid to voice an opinion that runs counter to that which is carried under the rainbow flag, which has become a flag of oppression. It's not a flag of liberation or tolerance. And it's profoundly disappointing that a coalition government does not have the strength or the will or the courage or the resolve to be able to ensure that what was promised to Australians in the marriage campaign, that no one else's freedoms would be affected, that is actually given effect in a post-same-sex marriage world. They are dithering on the Ruddock Review. They have capitulated essentially to the rainbow political movement, and now Australia is a less free place. And it's not just, if people think this is just going to stop at Christians, think again. 4.9 million Australians voted no. Many more regret it. They are not all Christians. And until every last Australian bows to this agenda, and particularly to its sinister agenda that follows, to teach children that their gender is fluid, no one will have any peace until that is enshrined in every public and private school in the country.
Sadly, Australians were lied to, and the government seems incapable of delivering on its promise to prevent attacks on people who disagree with same-sex marriage. After I went on Sky, prominent Liberal politician Tim Wilson tweeted to me, "Here's the problem, Lyle. You don't believe in live and let live. Nothing you have ever done has ever demonstrated that attitude. Instead, you've adopted as live and I'll tell you how to live, just like the hard leftists. I couldn't let that one go through to the keeper. When I was at Australian Christian Lobby in 2008, we supported the then Rudd government's removal of all discrimination against same-sex couples. So I tweeted back to Tim, "That's not true, Tim. As you know, I supported the removal of all discrimination against same-sex couples. I opposed redefining marriage because I knew it would lead to the crushing of dissenting Australians' freedoms, even though we were promised it would not." So Tim came back. "No, you didn't. You actually rhetorically supported it, but in the end opposed the legislation in 2008. Hashtag revisionism." Now, this was just Tim making stuff up. So I went back to him. "Tim, again, that is not true. The only aspect of the 2008 legislation we opposed was the nonsensical provision that children could be the product of a same-sex couple, when we all know it takes a mother and a father to produce a child. We backed every other law change." Well, I didn't hear back from Tim after that. Last December, after the plebiscite, amendments were put to the Parliament that would have protected Luke and Carla Burrell, Jason Tay, and the hundreds of thousands of parents who are now staring down the barrel of losing their freedom to have their children educated in an environment which actively upholds their values on marriage. A majority of coalition MPs and senators voted against these freedom-protecting amendments. They cast their votes for the rainbow flag. It's hard to see them coming back now. Next year's election will be all about freedom. It may be our last call for liberty. That's why Conservatives like me are running for the Senate. We will be your fearless voice for freedom. I'm Lyle Shelton. You're with the Queensland Conservative. Stay tuned for more. Welcome back. You're with the Queensland Conservative. I'm Lyle Shelton. It's summit season in the Asia Pacific, and our Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been mixing it on the international stage. The APEC gathering in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, broke up on Sunday, and for the first time, no joint agreement was able to be issued because there was no agreement. The American eagle and the Chinese panda were slugging it out over trade and strategic military dominance in the Pacific, while the Australian koala just tried to keep from being run over. One thing I noticed from APEC is that there is method to Donald Trump's supposed madness when it comes to the tariffs he has imposed on Chinese goods. This has been obscured because everything Trump does is mercilessly lampooned as self-evidently stupid by the high-minded elites in the mainstream media who can't abide the fact that not one of their own is president. Now, don't get me wrong, Trump is no paragon of virtue, although he is compared to Bill Clinton and John F. Kennedy, and that is saying something because Trump is no saint. As well as Marilyn Monroe, Kennedy had prostitutes in the White House, and there is at least one credible rape allegation outstanding against Bill Clinton. Trump has a brash personality, and he is often downright rude and ungracious to his opponents. But when it comes to policy, he is so far showing that he has the capacity to be a shrewd operator. Part of the standoff with China at APEC was over China's refusal to agree to language in the joint communique that called out predatory trade conduct by the Chinese corporations and US demands that Chinese government-owned entities compete on a level playing field with private enterprise. These are quite reasonable demands of the US that would benefit everyone. There has been far too much kowtowing to China over trade, and when Trump fired the first salvo by imposing tariffs on China for its unfair trading conduct, the political establishment went into apoplexy. How dare Trump violate the sacred cow of international trade, which is free trade? The trouble is that free trade has never been fair trade, particularly when it has come to dealing with the 1,200-pound panda in the room. Trump has had the courage to act and challenge China over its double standards, and this is what was being reflected at APEC this week. Representing Trump in Port Moresby was Vice President Mike Pence, who warned our small Pacific neighbours to be careful about being bought off by China, building them really cool stuff like airports and roads, and then drowning in a sea of Chinese debt and control. Then there was the announcement at APEC by Australia and the US to jointly fund with PNG a naval base at Manus Island, effectively locking China out of the opportunity for a deep-water port close to Australia. Watching government politicians at the weekend trying to deny the Manus naval base had anything to do with countering China was painful. This obvious doublespeak is what people hate about politicians. Australians are not stupid. With China flexing its military muscle in the Pacific and with its Confucius Institutes pumping out propaganda in our universities, it is not before time that the Allies stood up and pushed back. China doesn't like this, so this week it announced retaliatory action by way of an investigation into alleged dumping of Australian barley on the Chinese market. Now, Australian barley is not government subsidised, and the idea that Australian grain exporters would be selling onto the Chinese market at below world parity price is laughable. This is bullying, pure and simple. We all want to be friends with China and the Chinese people. We want to trade with them in ways that are mutually beneficial. But we cannot be naive to the fact that China is an undemocratic, totalitarian communist regime. It was founded by a brutal dictator, Mao Zedong, who murdered tens of millions of people. Unfathomably, Mao's picture remains above Tiananmen Square. Imagine if a photo of Hitler remained above the parade ground at Nuremberg. It is not possible to know if Beijing's long-term intentions are benign or malevolent. We applaud China's economic miracle, which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of grinding poverty. But Australia and the US are right to stand up to bullying, whether it's through military incursion to our sphere of influence or through unfair trade practices. China's purchase of agricultural land in Australia and the leasing of the Darwin port are activities we are not allowed to engage in China. China's activities on our university campuses are deeply suspicious and troubling. That is why Conservatives leader Senator Cory Bernardi has been calling for a royal commission into Chinese influence in Australia. Friendship with a rising power is not a one-way street. Sometimes it is necessary to stand up to a bully before it is too late. You've been with the Queensland Conservative. Thanks for tuning in. Until next week, I'm Lyle Shelton.